Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith. Hey everybody, this is Brian back with another episode of Grief to Growth. And today I've got with me Krista St. Germain. I'm going to read her bio and then we'll get started as we always do. Krista is a master certified life coach. She's a grief expert. She's a widow. She's a mom, and she's a host of the Widowed Mom podcast. When her husband was killed by a drunk driver in 2016, Krista's life was completely and unexpectedly flipped upside down. After therapy helped her unfurl from the fetal position, Krista discovered life coaching, post-traumatic growth, and learned the tools she needed to move forward and create a future she can get excited about. Now she coaches and teaches other widows so they can love life again too. So with that, I want to welcome Krista St. Germain to Grief to Growth.
Thank you, Brian. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I want to talk to you about your story, what happened with you. And I know you said in your introduction that therapy helped you. So I'd like to also find out what type of therapy you found that actually helped you to get through this.
Yeah. So my husband was my second marriage, kind of my redemption story after the first marriage didn't end well. And so I had met a lovely therapist, amazing therapist, while I was going through my divorce. And so I hadn't seen her in quite a while, but she was one of the first calls that I made after Hugo died. And so I don't know in terms of style of therapy, if I would classify it much more than just by saying I got a chance to tell my story as many times as I needed to tell it to make it real to my brain. Because in those early days, it was so surreal. And I'm sure, most people who have experienced a loss can relate to that, where you intellectually understand that what has happened is truly real and that they aren't actually coming back from a business trip in a week, but there's just a part of you that doesn't quite believe that. And so just being able to talk to her and tell the story and not burden, at least I felt like it was a burden, the other people in my life who either were grieving themselves or who didn't know what to do with my grief, was incredibly useful to me. I just needed to talk about the accident and talk about the details and, share all of my regrets and the guilt and the anger and just get it out until I could come to terms with what had happened and kind of get back to that baseline of functioning.
Yeah. So tell me about Hugo.
Oh, he was lovely. He's kind of a Renaissance guy. He was French Canadian, and he came to the town that I live in to work for Bombardier, which is a company that manufactures jets. And so he was an engineer, and so he was just kind of geeky, right? But really well-rounded. He could talk to you about anything. He was very shy, but had this boisterous, fun laugh. His French accent was very strong. He was just, he was all the things to me. He really was kind of proof to me that true love is possible, that I could be treated the way that I wanted to be treated, that there are people on the planet who will love you and accept you for all of your faults and flaws and darkness. And yeah, he was just an amazing guy.
So, how did you find out about his passing? Were you?
Yeah, I was there. So we had come back. Yeah, ironically, we had come back from a volunteer trip. So when I was in my early 20s, one of my sorority sisters was killed. And in her memory, we started a summer camp program for youth who are visually impaired. And so we were on our, 17th, 18th year of that program. And so Hugo and I had been volunteering it's called Heather's Camp, at Heather's Camp. And so we were on our way back home. We had driven separately. He'd gone out a couple of days ahead of me, and then I came out in my own vehicle. And so as we were coming home, I had a flat tire in my car, and I pulled off to the side of the road, shoulder of the interstate, and he pulled up behind me off to the side, blinkers on, caution lights, everything. And he just wanted to change the tire himself. We had paid for AAA, but his thought was, it'll just be faster. I can do it. There's a tire in the trunk. I don't want to wait on AAA. And to be quite honest, it was against my better judgment. I felt that the whizzing of the cars coming by on the highway, 80 miles an hour or so. But I didn't insist. I just said, okay. And so I was standing on the side of the road facing away from the traffic, but texting my daughter to let her know that we would be late because she was also returning from the trip, but she had ridden the bus with the children. And he was trying to get into my trunk to get access to the spare tire. And a driver that we later found out had meth and alcohol in his system. It's 5:30 on a Sunday, daylight, right? Wow. No brakes, just slammed into the back of the Durango, trapped him in between the Durango and the Camry. And, within 24 hours, he was gone. So I was right there for all of it.
Wow. I'm so sorry. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Thanks.
So even though you're right there, you mentioned earlier the shock, our brains just don't want to accept something like this happens, right? So what was it like in the early days and weeks following this? How was your brain functioning?
Yeah, just so surreal. I recently, since I just moved this weekend, I've been going through some of my old things. And one of the things that I looked at last couple of days was the journal that I kept right after he died. I kept that journal for quite a while, but I was reading through some of my earlier entries, and yeah, just this, I can't believe this happened. I can't believe it. Felt like everything that I had wanted in the future just evaporated. Right? Because not to say there weren't other facets of my life that were important and well-rounded, because there certainly were, but my vision for the future was of us. Right. The trips we were going to take and the memories we were going to make. And we had just hiked Mount Yale in Colorado, which is a 14er. We didn't train very well. It didn't go well. It was really bad. But, we had plans the next year to hike Mount Harvard. And so, yeah, I just couldn't really believe it. And I was so consumed in the early days also with what I should have done differently. In my mind, I should have pulled up farther on the highway. I should have insisted we call AAA. I should have had that tire checked before we left. We should have left at a different time. All of these things after the fact was still trying to control that just weren't ever meant to be controlled. But in the early days, I was trying really hard to just control them. Also, you're focused on, in the early days, just getting through the logistics. Right. Yeah, so just planning the service and dealing with the insurance and, of course, consoling my children. And, his mother flew into town and didn't make it before he passed because she lives in Quebec, and, dealing with having the family in town and all of that. It was just crazy. We had also booked a trip. We had bought in June, we had bought into a timeshare in Mexico. And we had scheduled a trip for the second week in August to take our children down there. So his son, my two children, and he died August 1st, and the trip was 2 weeks later. So trying to decide, do we still go on the trip? And we ultimately did, took my dad and took the kids and tried to just be normal. But it was just kind of a blur.
Yeah. I think, the thing about losses like this, I was just thinking before we got started, every loss is unique, of course. In my case, it was my 15-year-old daughter. In your case, it was your spouse. But in some ways, they're kind of universal. It's the fog that we go through. It's the surreal feeling like this couldn't have really happened. It's the you mentioned earlier, the anger and the guilt, the things that we think we should have been able to control. We should have been omniscient, right? We should have been able to see that this was coming, and we should have said or done something different. I think that's a very common experience that people go through. How did you learn to deal with that? How did you learn to deal with all of those different things?
Something in me just knew, pretty early on. And I don't exactly know why, but something in me just knew that that would not bear fruit that I wanted. Right. So I could kind of tell that it was an optional mind game that I could play with myself that if I allowed would go nowhere fast. And so somehow I was able to just kind of, I don't even know if it was shut it down, but just pivot a little bit in my thinking and just go, okay, yeah, we could have done it differently, but we didn't. And, whenever we're focusing on what we can't control, then that limits our ability to focus on what we can. So what can we control here? Here we are in this moment. This has happened. What aspects can we influence and where do we want to put our energy? I think some of it maybe came from just a lifelong love of self-development. And, I started at 16 reading A Return to Love with Marianne Williamson and, just always kind of on this spiritual path and self-development path. And so this, I think I had a lot of tools already in my tool belt of life and life experience and those things, they just were available for me to play off of.
Yeah, that sounds like you kind of were prepared at least in some way to understand, having done some of the self-development work and knowing that it's a dead end path, but it's a path that most of us go down at least for a while.
Yeah.
Until we figure out that it's a dead end path. And you talked earlier, you said, I want to kind of emphasize what you said about we think about all the things that we're missing out on, all the plans we had. And that's what we focus on. Suddenly we get very laser focused on that one aspect of our life and how it's going to change. So, and I'm saying this for the benefit of the people that are listening that have gone through this, because a lot of my clients are like, there's something wrong with me. I feel like, the brain fog and all this stuff. And it's like, no, this is a very common thing that we go through in this type of situation. I remember with Shana, you were talking about all the logistics, the family coming into town and making. And so a lot of people go on autopilot for the first few weeks and they'll even say, well, I feel like I'm numb. I'm not feeling anything. And it's because your brain's just kind of, you've gone into robotic mode. You're just doing the things you need to get done.
Yeah. And I'm in retrospect, I'm glad for that, because I think if I had felt the full impact of the loss instantly, it would have so overwhelmed me that I don't think I would have been able to function. So I think I'm really grateful that it did feel numb and hazy and confusing. I mean, there was still a lot of tears and a lot of railing, but to have felt the full brunt of it would have been just incomprehensible.
Did you feel any resentment to an outside force, whether it's God or anything else, the universe? But you this is your second chance at marriage, and it sounds like it was great. How did that play out for you?
Pardon me. Oddly, I didn't. And I know a lot of people do. And I don't want to say that I didn't in order to make anyone else think that they should be thinking the way that I was thinking. But I think my belief was that God, the universe, is love. Like that's where I come from, right? Like, so it's all divine, it's all love. And it's not, nobody's out there trying to harm you. Nobody's out there, punishing you for wrongdoings of your past, that I don't have to understand why it happened. And I don't even have to believe there's a purpose for it to have happened. But I don't believe, I choose not to believe that, I don't know, there's any ill will or anything to be mad about. It's just like, okay, didn't see this coming. This is not at all what I expected. This is not at all what I wanted. But yet, this is what it is.
Yeah. So tell me about your family. You mentioned you have children and Hugo has children. So how many, what ages are they?
Yeah. So at the time, my daughter was 12 and my son was 9. And then Hugo's son was 17. Yeah, almost 18 at the time. And it was it wasn't actually his biological son. It was his son from his first marriage, but he had been, in Lance's life since Lance was in diapers. So it was the only father he ever knew, but technically it wasn't his biological dad. So yeah. And Lance, lived with his mother And it was really rough. It was really rough on him to
Yeah,
lose his
I can
dad.
only imagine it had to be really tough on the children. And so you're dealing with your own grief while you're trying to help them deal with their grief, I assume.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting. I didn't expect, so I expected that my daughter would be the most sad. It's interesting. So what happened is that for my son, the youngest, his biggest impact was realizing that people you love can die,
Mm,
because he had never lost a grandparent. He had never lost anyone that he loved. And
mhm,
so for him, it became about the fear that I would die.
mm,
Right. And I
mhm,
remember him saying one time, I was tucking him into bed and he said, Mommy, I hope I die a couple of seconds before you die. That
mm.
way I don't ever have to live any without you.
Wow.
And so it was a different kind of loss for him compared to my daughter, who she felt the impact of what she lost in the future.
Mm,
Even though she had never really lost anyone that she loved that was, a close family relative either,
mhm,
she could see what Hugo and her relationship and that relationship would offer her in the future. She was looking forward to him. He was a barefoot water skier, a snow skier. She was looking forward to that, right? She was looking
mhm,
forward to him helping her with math. He's an engineer. So those things came easily to him.
mhm.
He was, would have been the one helping her with calculus.
Yeah,
And she was
yeah.
looking forward to that. She was looking forward to the French. She wanted to learn French from him. And so for her, it was just a different kind of loss. And then for Lance, it was, the loss of the only solid male role model in his life
Mm,
at
mhm.
a very important age.
Yeah, yeah, very important age, yeah. So, how are your kids dealing with it now? It's been about 5 years. Yeah, about 5 years coming up. So how are your kids dealing with it now?
Exceptionally well.
Um,
Exceptionally well. I think
okay.
my daughter must be an old soul.
Mm,
I remember one time we were at the cabin in Colorado, my dad's cabin, and Hugo loved it out there. And I was saying something about how we were looking at the valley because there's big picture windows in the house, and looking at the valley. And I told her, I said, I wish Hugo was here to see this. And she looked at me and she was like, Mama, he's here. Like,
mhm,
what are you talking about? Like,
mm.
how
Wow,
could you
wow.
ever think that he's not here? And I thought, okay, she's got it. Good reminder for me. Of course, like, how did I drift away from what I know to be true? But, for her, it was just kind of a done deal. I think, Lance ended up graduating from school, doing very well, joining the Marines, and figuring it out for himself. But,
Mhm.
you never know what it would have been like if he had had
Right,
his dad here. I don't
right.
know, but I think he's done remarkably well. I put both of my kids in just a little bit of grief counseling, but they didn't really seem to need it that much.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So how is I said earlier, every situation is a little bit different. And I know what it's like for parents to have children, pass. What are some unique challenges that widows face? What are some unique challenges you face going through grief as a widow?
Yeah. Such a good question. There's a lot. I think what's most shocking to most widows is they are so not prepared for how it will impact every area of life.
Hmm.
You often don't realize how much you rely on your partner for aspects of your purpose, right? For your thoughts about the future and what's possible for you, for your
Hmm.
self confidence. That's always a shock. I think people perceive themselves to be confident and then do not expect how unconfident they feel going forward. Um, yeah, it just permeates every aspect of life. Solo parenting,
Hmm.
right? All the pressure that we put on ourselves to be both parents.
Hmm.
So not helpful. Um, the drama of, when do you date again? Do you date again? How do you involve your kids in that? Do you go back to work? When? Well, what's the drama if you get life insurance money and how you spend it and what other people think of your choices? How long do you wear your wedding ring? When do you take it off? All of these kinds of things that you just never really gave much thought to before.
Right, right.
And then there they are.
Yeah, I can only Not even imagined. But I was just thinking about that when I was thinking about interviewing you. Ironically or synchronistically or whatever, we had a friend just pass away suddenly in March. She was 49 years old. A good friend that my wife and I have known for over 20 years.
Mm.
Friends with she and her husband, and went over to his house for dinner a few weeks ago, and just the dynamic of. And I was going to ask you this, because when you're together as couples, right? A lot of times when we're married, we're friends as couples. So what happens when one person, we've had people get divorced before, but when suddenly one of your friends is single,
Mhm.
that's got to be a weird dynamic for both you and for the other people.
So much so. Yeah, I just did a podcast episode on being the third wheel because that's how it feels. Right? Is that you are the third wheel, and how do you interact with these people? And what if they were your partner's friends more so than yours? And now you feel like the odd person out. And it's just, there's a lot. Relationships with in-laws can be very challenging.
Yeah.
I'm watching a lot of my clients right now go through to this kind of, we're coming back into a functioning society, as things start to reopen.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been some elements of, being at home that have been kind of easier to deal with for some people, harder in some ways, but easier in others, And so
Right.
now
Right.
my moms are going back to the baseball diamond and answering the awkward question of, what does your husband do for a living?
Mm-hmm.
Those kinds of things, or, just getting back out in the world and figuring out how to function without their person. It's really a challenge.
Yeah, I'm curious. Did you have friends fall away? Were there some that just couldn't handle it, or?
Less so than I imagined. I was really lucky in that he and I worked together at the same company.
Oh, okay.
And so I don't think a lot of people have that luxury. And some people might not even think it's a luxury. Some people might choose to see it differently. But I just felt so surrounded both by family who loved me and friends who loved me, but also by coworkers who not only loved me, but loved him and felt that loss, felt the impact of that loss, and just rallied. So, yes, relationships have changed over time, but if anything, I don't know, people seem to come out of the woodwork to be kind to me.
Yeah, that's great,
Yeah.
because a lot of times when there's a loss, no matter what the loss is, people just get awkward and they don't know what to say, and sometimes they don't know
Yeah.
what to say. They just kind of go away.
Yeah.
And I want to go over some of the things, because I know there's no pat answers for any of these, but when your clients, I'm sure they ask you questions like, when should I start dating again, or how long do I wear my ring, and stuff like that. So what are those conversations like?
Yeah. Well, they're always, with the foundation of, I don't know what's best for your life, but you do.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So let's not use what Krista thinks as the authority here. Let's use what you think. And then also, just timelines aren't relevant when it comes to these things. So, I wore my wedding ring for, I don't know, a year. And then at a certain point, it felt like time to take it off. I
Mm-hmm.
switched it from one hand to another.
Mm-hmm.
And then at a certain point, it felt like it was time to take it off. With how long do you keep things, clothing and memorabilia? And to me, you just don't rush it. You do what feels right to you. There's no reason to rush into any of this. You do it in stages if you want to do it in stages, but it's not going anywhere. You don't have to hurry through that. Dating again. Are you looking to fill a hole, a void?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if that's the reason, you probably won't enjoy your dating experience or your relationship experience as much as you will if you go into it doing kind of some of that self work that sometimes needs to be done, and get yourself to a position where you realize, no, actually, I am whole and worthy and fully complete. And I don't have a missing piece that I need to find, or fill. I've
Mm-hmm.
got me. And the reason I might want to date again is not to fill a void. It's to love, to find someone to love, right?
Mm-hmm.
To experience more love. And then it becomes about giving and less about getting. And it's more fun, right? It's not, we don't end up being so needy and clingy, and there's less drama that way.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
that's great advice, because I would also imagine, and I don't know, so I just say, did you have friends saying, okay, Krista, it's time to get back out there again, trying to fix you up?
Yes. And I was not ready for a long time. And there's nothing against anyone who's ready immediately, right?
Mhm.
The first time I went out, I remember going out with someone and I didn't think it was a date. I thought it was just me getting together with a coworker who I hadn't seen in a while.
Mhm.
And I realized while we were on this pseudo date that he thought it was a date and I was not ready. I went to my car and I just cried. I was really angry. That was probably the angriest I've ever been. Just that I did not want to have to date again. Felt like I had worked so hard to find Hugo, right?
Right.
And I was like, oh, I don't want to be here. I just want Hugo. It's just so unfair. And so I eased my way into it. I didn't date until almost 4 years in, 3.5, 4 years.
Okay.
But
So
yeah, people do want to hook you up because they think it's a problem. We're socialized to believe that we're supposed to be in a relationship,
right.
especially as women. Sometimes we're taught to believe that our value is as a parent, as a mom, as a wife, and that we can't be okay alone. And so people think they're being very helpful.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure.
But yeah, that's not how I experienced it.
We'll get back to Grief to Growth in just a few seconds. Did you know that Brian is an author and a life coach? If you're grieving or know someone who is grieving, his book, Grief to Growth, is a best-selling, easy-to-read book that might help you or someone you know. People work with Brian as a life coach to break through barriers and live their best lives. You can find out more about Brian and what he offers at www.grieftogrowth.com, www.grief2growth.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/grieftogrowth, www.patreon.com/GRIEF2growth to make a financial contribution. And now, back to Grief to Growth.
So let's talk about you mentioned in some of the notes you sent me, mentioned something about post-traumatic growth. So what is post-traumatic growth to you and how does that apply?
Yeah. So post-traumatic growth, I remember when I heard about post-traumatic growth, it was like the record scratch moment, where you're like, what? Because I think everyone's familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder, but I had never really heard this idea of post-traumatic growth. So it's this idea developed by a couple of researchers, Tedeschi and Calhoun, in the early 90s, that not only can you bounce back from a trauma, meaning that you can get back to the same level of functioning and the same level of life satisfaction, which used to be the goal, right? It was to get back to where you were before the trauma. But these two researchers came along and offered the idea, of course, because they studied it, that you could actually achieve growth after trauma, that you could take that trauma and then leverage it, right? And become more satisfied with your life, live a life that's even more aligned with what you value, that's even more filled with possibility and deeper spiritual connection and better relationships and, stronger appreciation and all of these things. And so it's kind of my biggest pet peeve. I think sometimes we use this phrase new normal against ourselves. I don't know how you feel about it, but yes, it's never going to be the same as it was when the person was in the flesh right next to us. But what I see is that a lot of people use that phrase against themselves, and they'll say things like, well, I'm getting used to my new normal. And it's said with this resignation implied that life will never be as good as it once was, but I'm getting used to it.
Right.
And so what I love about post-traumatic growth is it just really, blows that theory up and says, no, your loss is your loss and you get to be the boss of your life and you get to decide if you want to grow. It's not that it's, morally superior to do that, but you get to be the boss. And I just love that.
Yeah, I think that's really wise. And, I have a lot of clients who say to me, will I ever get back to the person I was before? And I always say to them, I hope you don't. I hope you become a better person,
Yeah.
Otherwise you're just wasting this experience that you've gone through. And there's always this tension that, we were always going to carry that loss with us, that pain, that we're going to have that longing and stuff, but it doesn't mean our lives can't be good again. And I think a lot of times, especially in those early days, the biggest thing is believing that it can be good, believing that we can actually, do do well from this and do better. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, it's it's a relatively short period of time since Hugo's passing. How long was it before you decided to become a life coach?
Pretty fast. So that
Hmm.
was another one of the tools that I had in my tool belt. Was I had been following a life coach, just listening to her podcast. And so, and aware of her tools and what she taught, but
Mhm.
really not ever interested in being a life coach. In fact, I would refer people to her podcast and I would tell them to ignore the life coach part. Because I guess I just, I don't know, I'm from the Midwest and maybe we're slow to adapt to trends here, but I kind of thought maybe it was sketchy. So,
Mhm.
but I got to that point where, I was back to functioning. I was back to work. My therapist was saying, "You're doing so great. You're so strong," all the things. And I'm thinking in my mind, okay, thank you. And I agree that I am doing well, but also on the inside, just feeling kind of hollow and empty and thinking there has to be more for my life than this. Like it can't just be checking off the to-do list and going to work and feeding the children and robotically going through the motions.
Mhm.
And two things kind of happened at the same time. One was that my therapist said, "You should be a therapist."
Mhm.
She had it all planned out. She said, "I'll help you get into an MFT program. When I retire, you can buy my practice." I mean, she was like, she was ready.
Wow.
And so in December, so Hugo died in August. In December, I applied for that MFT program, had to wait until the following September for it to start. And in January, the coach that I had been following started a program that I joined. And so I was taking another prerequisite for the MFT that I didn't have from my bachelor's degree, abnormal psych class. And I was showing up and being coached as a part of this program that this coach was running.
Hmm.
And it was so powerful for me that 6 months, just really 6 months of that program, that I decided I don't want to be a therapist. I
Hmm.
want to be a coach.
Hmm.
First, I thought, well, I'll just go through the MFT program and I'll do coaching on the side as I work my way through the MFT program, because it was going to take a couple of years plus working full time. And then by the time it came time to start, I decided, no, it's the scarier path to become a coach, but this is calling me and I can't ignore this call. And this is what I needed. All the tools I was learning through that coaching program were the reason I was changing profoundly.
Yeah.
And I just decided everybody's going to think I'm crazy, and that's okay. I'm just going to go for it. So in September, I started training. So Hugo died in August. The next September, I did my life coach training in person, took another 3 or 4 months to do the follow-up and actually get certified and finish it. And then I quit my job in January.
Wow. Wow.
I know, right? And I actually happened to quit my job to go and work for that coach.
Okay.
On a trial, which felt very safe to me because she offered me, it was a slight pay cut from what I was making, but it felt like a solid job. And it didn't work out. It was like a trial kind of job, and it just didn't work for either of us. But it helped me get out of my job, right? It helped me leave that corporate world that I was in. And so I just decided when that didn't work out, I was just going to throw myself into coaching and just go for it and not look back. And I didn't. And
Wow.
yeah, it was rough the first year. It took a while to build a successful business, but man, I can't imagine actually still being at that job. Most people are being laid off, production line shutting down.
Yeah.
It's not deeply satisfying.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, you're a fantastic example of post-traumatic growth. And it's interesting, as you were telling your story, you were saying you're from the Midwest. I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Ohio. And I would hear about life coaches, and I would actually make jokes about life coaches. There was a meme I actually posted before I became a coach that says, eat more kale. There, I'm your life coach. Because I'm like, really, is it just rich people that have life coaches that just have too much money? What's the deal with this life coaching thing? And with me, it was a friend that I happened to be working with. She's a medium, and I do this work with helping parents heal.
Yeah.
And she said, "Brian, there's this life coaching class that I saw online. I thought you might want to take it." And I was like, "Why would you think I would want to take a life coaching class?" And then I realized a lot of what I was doing with people was I was coaching them. And so it's kind of like, well, yeah, I might as well do this. But it still feels weird when I tell people, that I do life coaching, but it's so satisfying. It's such great work.
Yeah, because most people don't understand what you mean when you say that you do life coaching. They're like, well, what do you mean? What is that exactly? I think it's becoming more familiar, but yeah, it's still less known than
Yeah,
other
it is. And
industries.
there are different aspects. And some people are like, I need a life coach to help me lose weight, stuff
Mhm.
like that. Or I need a life coach. And that's stuff that I can do. But my specialty is more around grief. I know yours is,
Right.
dealing with what you've gone through. So you work with widows for the most part, or
Yeah.
is it exclusively with widows?
Exclusively. Yeah.
Okay.
Exclusively. And honestly, when I decided to become a coach, I really wasn't planning to work with widows. I thought it would be too sad.
Mm.
And so I just hadn't done enough of my own work yet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then at a certain point, I realized, oh, wait a minute, why would I work with anyone else? Why would I? Right? Like I have an insight into this experience, and there's nothing else out there. At least at the time, there was nothing else out there like it. It
Mm-hmm.
was so it was really fun to go and create what I wish I could have found. Right.
Right.
To take what I know about grief and all the grief studies that I've done, and then what I learned from my teacher and in certification, and then, just take all of that life experience and, like it sounds like what you've done, right? And then put it together in a way that helps a very specific problem.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I call myself a grief guide and a life coach, and I put them both out there. I've
Mm-hmm.
done very little. I've done a couple people that are life coach clients, but most of them are coming to me because of grief.
Yeah.
And so I think we kind of attract the clients that need us and that we can help.
Yes.
And as I was saying, it's really when you can talk to someone and say, I've been through what you're going through, I think that gives you a lot more credibility with them, and they
Mm-hmm.
really can feel like they can relate to you. And it's interesting because I have people that I offer half-hour consultation. People say, I don't
Mm-hmm.
know what this is about, but somebody just sign up for the half an hour. It almost always goes an hour at least.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, oh yeah, now I see what this is. Now I get
Yeah.
it. So it's really it's great. And I applaud you for taking that leap of faith to go out and do this and to allow this experience in your life to launch you into the next thing.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm so glad that I did. It's given me so much more than I could ever give. Honestly, the people that I serve, it's so fulfilling. I just can't imagine doing anything else now.
So when you work with clients, what can a client expect? If I'm a widow and I'm like, okay, I might reach out to her, what would I expect a session to be like, or the
Yeah.
process to be like?
Well, I do groups now, so I don't do any more one-on-one. For in the early days, I just did just exclusively one-on-one. And then at a certain point, you hear the same stories over and over and over. You hear the same ways that people think there's something wrong with them when what you know is that it's just grief.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so I got to that place where I thought, if I could just get people together, not because we're going to go around the room and each talk and share. That's not how I do it. But because if one woman can hear another woman's story and see herself in that story, and she can see, oh, it's not me. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm not broken. I'm not damaged. This is just the way of it. Then we can get some of those basic, but really challenging grief aspects. We can work through them faster. And then we can move on to the things that are kind of more individual. So the way that I run my program, it's a 6-month program, all widows, all moms. And I coach in a group setting. So I coach, on Zoom, Brady Bunch style. So
Hmm.
everyone can see each other. They can turn their cameras off if they don't want to, but I
Hmm.
coach one person at a time while everyone else watches, which is
Hmm.
amazing because I find that our brain can be a little bit resistant. I don't know if this resonates with you, but our brain can be a little bit resistant when we're the one in the hot seat,
Hmm.
because the coach is challenging you a little bit in a loving way.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's kind of sometimes hard to absorb it, versus the experience of watching someone else get coached when it's not your life and your brain isn't resistant and you can so clearly see the issue, and you can watch the coach and the client work together on it and go, oh, that's what's happening to me. I'm doing that. Like she's getting coached on the challenge that she's having with her mother-in-law and her thoughts about her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law is telling her she's responsible for her spouse's death or whatever. And I'm having that, a very similar challenge with my sister-in-law. It's maybe different,
Hmm.
but so easy to leverage what other people are going through without the brain being in that kind of resistant state.
Yeah.
So we do a lot of group calls in that way. I do a lot of coaching online. We use an app so that, in between calls, because maybe something comes up tomorrow and the next call isn't until Thursday or whatever, they can come to me inside the app. A lot of celebrating, a lot of training our brain to focus on what we want to see more of.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also have a self-paced component to my program. So my goal is just to give people the tools that they need, all the tools that I wish I would have had, the pathway to work through the most common obstacles. Even if they don't get it all done within 6 months, they'll have it forever.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then I can set them up to be self-sufficient at the end of the 6 months. So they understand grief. They understand how their brain works. They understand how to manage their emotional life. They understand, as oddly as it sounds, how to feel their feelings, because nobody taught us this.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's the first thing I teach people, is how to feel feelings. I teach them how to do emotional freedom technique tapping, because I just am in love with that tool, and position them well, so that by the end of 6 months, they've worked through what they came to work through and they're, ready to go.
That sounds awesome. Yeah. And that's the thing. I think a lot of people confuse life coaching with therapy or traditional therapy, and they think it's like a lifelong thing. And one of the things when I was going through life coaching training, and I loved it, the program I took, the guy was like, our job is to make people self-sufficient. It's not to make them dependent on us. We don't want, not that we don't want, but clients shouldn't have to come to us for years and years and years. If they are, we're not doing our jobs.
We're not doing our jobs. I could not agree with you more. Interestingly, I think I have some lifers in my program. And I think it's because most widows don't have other widows in their orbit. Mm-hmm. To really have that sense of community with. And that is the one thing I see, is that a lot of them don't want to leave. It's not because they don't have the tools. It's just because they love the support and they love the environment. And it's not even so much about me as it is about the community. And so, I prepare them to graduate at the 6-month mark, but I also have an opportunity for them to keep going if they want to. And as long as they're not using that as a crutch, it's good.
I think the community is very important. I mentioned a couple of times, I'm part of Helping Parents Heal, we're about 17,000 parents who have had children transition. And just that, not feeling like you're alone, like you're not the only one this has happened to. And to, as you said, the group thing, because we have calls, and when people come on and say, yeah, I went through this, or I'm going through this, and people go, oh, then I'm not crazy.
I'm not crazy.
It's not just me. And all these things, the dealing with the family dynamics, it's like I said, I was being interviewed on a program, and I slipped up, because we're not supposed to compare grief, and but parents, when we've lost a child, we think that's the worst. I mean, frankly. Mm-hmm. So I was talking with these people, and I said, I had the worst thing. I lost a daughter, a 15-year-old daughter, and this woman that was interviewing me says, I've actually lost a child, and I just lost my husband. And she said, for me, losing my husband was worse, because it's every aspect of your life. It's all day. And we know that when we get married, we even say it, till death do us part, but we don't really believe that's going to happen.
Right.
Or it's going to happen
until we're 90.
Right. And it's not supposed to happen until we're 90. It's not supposed to happen, while we still have kids in the house. It's not supposed to happen while we're still, as I said, with my friend, this was sudden. I mean, she had a blood clot, and just was here one day and literally gone the next. And we're all, still, like, my wife was in book club with her, and we're like, this is just really surreal for us. And then, trying to figure out how to deal with the other person. So it's complicated for everybody, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I think it's just subjective, right?
Yeah.
It's each human having a different experience, because each human is interpreting their experience differently.
Yeah.
And so, to your point, it's not so useful to compare, because who are we to say what I might experience as traumatic might not be so traumatic for someone else, and vice versa. And that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. But I like your idea of people being in groups and being able to benefit from you coaching other people. And I hadn't thought about that before, but sometimes we do get resistant or defensive when someone's talking directly to us. But if you're talking to somebody else, we can see the problem of the other person and say, they need to listen to what Krista's saying.
Yeah. Or one person's bravery will just be so valuable to the rest of the people there, because maybe they would have never brought it up,
Right.
like, sex after grief, like, oh, nobody wants to talk about that. But then somebody will bring it up. And then, you hear the echoes in the chat of, oh, me too, me too, me too. I'm so glad you said it. I was too embarrassed to talk about it. And so you can really, in a comfortable, loving, supportive environment, bring up some stuff that's just hard for people to talk about and normalize it.
Yeah, exactly. So, Krista, if people want to find out more about you, if they want to reach out to you, find out more about your program, how can they do that?
Yeah. So they can go to coachingwithkrista, KRISTA.com, or I love sending people to my podcast. And don't let the name deceive you. My goal, even though I only, work on a paying client basis with women who are widows and moms, I hope that my podcast will help people who are grieving in general. And it's called the Widowed Mom Podcast. So pretty easy to find. So if they maybe aren't a widow, but they just want to learn more, they can go to the podcast.
Yeah. And there was one other thing I wanted to talk to you about, because we kind of talked about it a little bit before we got started. And it was about spirituality. And I know you said you don't specifically mention that in your coaching practice. I obviously make it a big part of what I do with my podcast and my practice. So how do you help people have hope? How do you help people, because I can only, again, when we lose a spouse, something like that, we're like, this is it. I'm just done. This is the worst thing that could ever happen. So how do you get people past that?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that helps is just that they see my life's example. Right. And then I always make a point of sharing other widows' journeys so that they can see it in other people too. So they don't think that I'm a special snowflake.
Yeah.
Right. Because a lot of times I think that tends to happen is people only show us the highlight reel on their Instagram. And so they think, oh, she must be special. So I try to tell a lot of stories. And then also, I know this sounds odd maybe, but at a certain point, I find hope is useful when you're feeling hopeless. Right. But then also, how do I even want to say this? The need for hope implies that where you are is wrong. Right. The need for hope implies that we need to be somewhere in the present or in the past, in the future or in the past, as opposed to how do we stay in the present and find the beauty here?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point, because you're right. Hope implies a future state that's different from the state that we're in. So it's, I guess, a matter of helping people feel comfortable with where they are. Yeah.
And live in this moment.
Yeah.
Which it might suck, but it is what we have right now. Right. And I believe the good only exists because we have the context of the quote unquote bad. Right. We know joy because we have despair. And so we've been socialized to believe that the bad is to be avoided. But really, if we want to look at it as a valuable part of our human experience, I think that opportunity is available to us. And I think that's what adds a rich depth of experience. And, that's appealing to me.
Yeah, well, that's a hard lesson for a lot of us to take, right? Because we just want joy all the time. We're like, why would I choose a life that has quote bad stuff in it?
But we're sold that, right? At every turn, we're sold joy. We're sold happiness. We're supposed to be happier than we are, and that's what creates so much suffering. Is this idea that we're supposed to be somewhere other than where we are? Right. When if we could just relax into where we are, as uncertain and as sometimes painful as it feels, without thinking that we're supposed to be somewhere else, we would save ourselves a lot of suffering.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Very wise. Thank you. Any last thoughts you want to share with us before we leave for today?
I love this conversation. I'm just really grateful to be here.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I applaud you for what you're doing, which you've done, for your bravery, and then for your sharing with other people to help other people come along through this journey that we always talk with Helping Parents Heal. This is the club nobody wants to be in.
Yeah.
And being in a situation that you're in, I'm sure is something that you would have never wished or anticipated. But to take that and to turn it into something beneficial, something beautiful is just an amazing transformation.
That's one thing I would say, Brian, just to add on to that,
Mhm.
because I think a lot of times people think, well, if I'm going to grow from the experience, then I have to be glad it happened. And I just would want to offer that we don't have to be glad it happened to
Right.
still choose to grow from the experience.
Right.
And yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point also, because it's hard because my daughter, it'll be 6 years in 3 days since she passed.
Mm-hmm.
And I only know one person that I've worked with, and I've worked with hundreds of people who has said, I'm glad that my child passed,
Mm-hmm.
and not in a mean sense, but in the sense that I have a better relationship with them now than I did before. It's because of a deep spiritual understanding. But for most of us, we're like, yes, I've chosen to make something good out of this. And yes, there's growth that's come through this, but I would give anything to have my daughter back. I would not, my human Brian would not choose this. And this is for me where spirituality comes in, because I think from a higher perspective, I understand why I'm going through this. And from a higher perspective, I can get through it. But the part of me, I'm looking at myself now, because I see Shane over my shoulder, and I miss her every time I look at her.
Yeah.
So I want people to understand that when we say that we're taking something and we're going to grow from it, it doesn't mean that we're glad it happened. It doesn't mean we're ever going to be glad that it happened. It doesn't mean that we don't have bad days, that we don't have bad times. I can't speak for you, but I do. I still do. And I probably always will at some point.
Yep. Totally agree. This move, having just moved, oh my gosh, all the stuff that came up just moving out of that house where I had so many memories and still had stuff to deal with. And grief grenades everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the way of it.
Yeah, they're out there. And I tell people, don't try to avoid them. Some people say, I'm going to avoid, you can't avoid the triggers.
No.
They're out there. They're all over the place. Just walk through the minefield and let them blow up.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being here, Krista. It was great to see you. Hopefully people will reach out to you and, learn more about your coaching program. Listen to the podcast, the Widowed Mom podcast, if you want to hear more from Krista. And then, hopefully if you see that she would be a good fit for you for a coach, reach out to her.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Bye. So that does it for another episode of Grief to Growth. I sure hope you enjoyed it. If you like this content, make sure you subscribe. So click on the subscribe button here, and then click on the bell to receive notifications, and click on all. That way you'll be notified whenever I release new content. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.